Hey everyone! Tonight we're going to unravel something quietly astonishing, something that begins with breath and ends in silence. Your blanket's warm, your chair creaks a little as you shift. Somewhere outside, the world hums its usual noise. But if you close your eyes for a moment, you might just feel it, that ghost of a whisper trailing behind your heartbeat. That's your ancestry. That's the weight of time. Because you probably wouldn't survive even one day in the world your ancestors crawled through. Not one single day. So before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And if you're listening in bed, tell me your local time and where you are. I love seeing who's dreaming along with me. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin tonight's journey. This is you, right here, breathing, blinking, maybe chewing on a snack or procrastinating something important. Now zoom out. No, way out. There's your dad, his dad, and his. Keep going, backward, until names become smudges and faces blur into carvings on bones. You zoom past powdered wigs, rusty helmets, soot-black chimneys, past people who hunted whales by candlelight and people who hunted each other in trees. Eventually, you'll reach a man squatting in the dirt, chewing on something that may have once been a beetle, and trying, very hard, not to die before sundown. That guy? That's your ancestor. He has no name, no birth certificate, and certainly no idea that one day a descendant of his would lie in bed with earbuds, wondering if organic shampoo really matters. But you exist because he, and thousands like him, didn't die when they statistically should have. That's it. No divine destiny, no master plan, just violent coincidence, stubborn biology, and a whole lot of people who managed to stagger through life long enough to make more people. Some call that survival. I call it a cosmic joke. See? We like to think we're here because we were meant to be. But truthfully, we're here because nobody dropped the baby at the wrong time, stepped on the wrong snake, or caught the wrong infection in the wrong place. Evolution didn't pick you. It just didn't not pick you. It's sobering, isn't it? But weirdly comforting too. You don't need to earn your existence. You already won the least glamorous lottery imaginable. 1,000 generations of people almost died, but didn't. And now you get to order boba and complain about Wi-Fi. Let's be clear. Humanity barely made it. Our ancestors didn't live in eras. They survived through them. And some eras were especially cruel. Catastrophes so thorough that nature itself seemed like it had a personal grudge against mammals. There were winters where nothing grew, centuries where everything died, and decades when death rode horses, and you, soft, modern you, were almost deleted 1,000 times. So tonight, we're not just going to talk about history. We're going to take a sleepy little walk through 5 of the most horrifying moments humanity survived. The kind of events that trim family trees like hedge clippers on a sugar high. The kind that leave scars so deep, they show up in our DNA today. We'll start light. Well, as light as extinction-level events can be. The Ice Age. Then we'll shiver through the accidental nightmare of agriculture. Meet the Mongols. Dance with the Black Death. And finish with fire and ash under the darkest sky Earth has ever known. But before we jump into that icy abyss, let me offer one small, wrinkled thought from someone older than this story. Survival is not noble, it is ordinary. But to reflect on survival, that is sacred. And sometimes, the most sacred thing we can do is laugh. Because oh boy, our ancestors were a mess. They were scrappy, smelly, short-tempered, brilliant, and half crazy from hunger most of the time, but they made it. Somehow. Which means you can too. And hey, fun side note, if just one of your ancestors, just one, had decided to become a celibate cave poet instead of procreating, you wouldn't be here. So thank you, unnamed cave romantic, for getting over your breakup long enough to do the thing. Ready? Let's go rank the times you almost weren't born. Imagine waking up every morning knowing there's a non-zero chance you'll be eaten by something with saber teeth. Welcome to the Ice Age, or as your ancestors probably called it, Tuesday. We're about 20,000 years in the past, at the peak of what scientists now call the last glacial maximum, a time when glaciers didn't politely hang out on mountaintops. They just bulldozed continents. Entire chunks of North America, Europe, and Asia were under ice sheets 2 miles thick. Temperatures were a casual 10 degrees colder than today, which might not sound like much, until you realise it was enough to turn vast forests into frozen deserts and rivers into highways for migrating reindeer. Food wasn't scarce, it was mythical. You didn't eat unless something died, and most of the time, that something was trying very hard not to die. Your diet, mammoth. Again, if you were lucky, your tools, sharpened rocks and a prayer. Your clothing, animal hide stitched together with sinew and freezing optimism. You probably lived in a hut made from mammoth bones and fur, which, while undeniably metal, had all the insulation of a wet sock. Want warmth? Congratulations, you've invented hugging, and yet, they adapted. Somehow, cave paintings, like the ones in Lascaux, are some of the oldest known pieces of art we have. Think about that. During an age when survival meant not freezing solid while chasing a bison with a pointy stick, someone still had the audacity to doodle on a wall. That's hope. Or at least, boredom. Every morning, survival was a checklist. Don't freeze, don't starve, don't get trampled, don't get eaten by the cave lion Panthera spelaea, which was not only real, but also huge, carnivorous, and probably very annoyed about the weather. Modern problems, like whether oat milk foams right, feel hilariously optional compared to these daily challenges. And hygiene? Non-existent. If you got a cut while skinning an elk, that might be the end of your story. There were no antibiotics, no gauze, no vaccines. Your options were rub moss on it, chew a root, or just accept your fate and become a cautionary tale around the fire. That fire, by the way, was sacred. It wasn't for vibes, it was for not dying. Fire meant cooked food, warm nights, and a slim chance your fingers wouldn't fall off. Losing it meant starting over, with a flint that may or may not work in wind gusts strong enough to blow your eyebrows into next week. Here's something most people forget. We weren't the only humans around. Neanderthals roamed the earth too, stockier, stronger, and arguably better adapted to the cold. But they vanished. Why? Nobody's quite sure. Some say interbreeding, others blame climate change or competition. My theory? They took one look at the coming millennia and noped out. An odd side note. Our ancestors had dogs. Sort of. Evidence suggests wolves began hanging around human camps during this time. Probably not out of friendship, but because scraps of meat taste better than chasing deer for 40 miles. It was a mutual, you don't eat me, I won't eat you agreement. The world's first roommate situation. And the worst part, there was no end in sight. Ice ages didn't have expiration dates printed on the glacier. People just kept going, generation after generation, building memories, stories, and muscles from snow and suffering. I sometimes wonder what they would think of us, wrapped in blankets, clicking on podcasts, stressed about emails. Would they envy us or pity us? We have everything, and yet we spend our days wondering what we're missing. There's an old reflection I keep close. Luxury makes us soft, but hardship sharpens the soul. Our ancestors weren't lucky. They were relentless. Survival wasn't a goal. It was the only option. And honestly, the fact that they managed to keep going through a literal planetary deep freeze makes me think that complaining about slow Wi-Fi might be just slightly overdramatic. But here's where it gets funny. Despite all the suffering, there was community. These weren't solitary hermits grunting in caves. They were families, clans, tribes. They mourned, laughed, fought, sang. We found flutes made of bone, necklaces, paintings of animals they admired and feared. They weren't just surviving, they were living. That's the part that sticks with me. Even in the Ice Age, humans couldn't help but make art and music, as if we knew, deep down, that survival without beauty wasn't quite enough, as if in the middle of frostbite and famine, someone still said, "Hey, you know what would really tie this cave together? A reindeer mural." So if you've ever felt like your ancestors were tougher than you, well, yeah, they were. But they were also weird, imaginative, deeply tired people just trying to make it one more day, and one more day is all it ever takes to become a legend. You'd think surviving the Ice Age would earn humanity a breather, a little post-trauma vacation, maybe. But no, we're humans. We saw the glaciers retreat and thought, cool, Let's go poke a lion. Fire was no longer a luxury, it was expected. We were walking upright, inventing pointy things, and starting to form words that meant more than run or ow. In short, we were getting cocky. But the world was still out to kill us. Take the cave lion, Panthera spelaea. Imagine a house cat. Now imagine that house cat is 10 feet long, weighs over 800 pounds, and looks at you the way you look at an unguarded sandwich. These lions were apex predators, fast, quiet, and deeply uninterested in your dreams or aspirations. Your best defense, fire, or 50 of your loudest, angriest cousins waving spears and yelling things that probably translated to nope, and still they came. This wasn't just a time of survival, it was a time of chaos. Every day was roulette. You might find berries. You might find a snake inside those berries, or worse, find a different group of humans who think you are the berries. Caves were crowded, and not the fun kind of crowded. You shared space with grumpy elders, shrieking children, and that one guy who definitely didn't wash after handling dead animals. Privacy doesn't exist. Personal space? Only if you count the 6 inches between you and a fire. But somehow, communities flourished. Maybe it was necessity. Maybe it was the knowledge that alone, you were a snack. But together, you were something more. A tribe, a story, a noise in the dark that frightened even the big things. We started carving, scratching pictures into bone and rock, animals we feared, hunts that succeeded, people we loved. There were no museums, no likes, no merch, just the raw need to leave a mark. I was here, I mattered. An odd side fact, we used red ochre a lot in our art. Some say for spiritual reasons, others just because it looked cool. Whatever the case, we painted death in crimson long before we wrote poems about it. And the conversations, oh, they were riveting. Did you see the elk today? Yes, it saw me back. End of scene. Still, there was wisdom in those grunts. Some of the first philosophers may have been the ones who looked at the stars and didn't immediately try to throw a spear at them. They wondered, they waited, they drew circles in the dirt and asked why. Here's something else. Early humans had surprisingly good memories. Before writing, everything had to be remembered. Songs, migration paths, stories, instructions on how not to die from poisonous mushrooms. Your life was as long as your brain could hold it. And if you messed up, well, let's just say there were no second drafts in the Ice Age. There's an old whisper from anthropology I like to recite. Humans survived not because we were the strongest, but because we were the best at gossip. Seriously. Being able to say, "Don't trade with Throg, he waters down his mammoth meat," probably saved lives. Trust was currency, reputation, king. If someone in your group couldn't be trusted, they weren't around long enough to make it to story time. Laughter? Oh yes, we had that too. Because if you can't laugh after getting chased by a bear twice in 1 week, are you even human? You've got to admire the stubborn optimism of it all. That daily decision to keep going, to face frostbite, famine, and feline predators with the fragile hope that maybe tomorrow will suck slightly less, that maybe the mammoth will trip this time, that maybe your cousin won't fart directly into the communal fire pit again. Even back then, humans were complicated, brutal and kind, hungry and generous, scared and poetic. We buried our dead, we sang over them, we gave names to things we didn't understand. Thunder wasn't just noise, it was a god clearing his throat. So much of what we are today, the love, the fear, the rituals, the jokes, all of it was already there, curled beside the fire, etched into bones, whispered through the cracks of damp caves. And yet, we rarely think of them. The ones who came before fire was a given, before shelter was anything more than luck and a rock overhang. We live in skyscrapers and swipe through glass screens, but we're still, in many ways, just those same anxious mammals hoping the storm passes before the food runs out. Here's your quirky note for tonight. Some of the earliest jewellery ever discovered, beads, shells, tiny carvings, wasn't functional at all. Just pretty. Proof that even 40,000 years ago, someone said, "This will look awesome with my bear pelt." So the next time you feel primitive for crying over spilled coffee or refreshing your inbox for the 10th time, remember this. Your ancestors screamed at clouds, ran from cats, and still found time to accessorize. They were wild, they were brilliant, and most importantly, they were you, just with worse Wi-Fi. At some point, Some brilliant caveman looked around and said, "You know what? I'm tired of running after things with horns." And just like that, humanity invented farming. Okay, it probably wasn't that poetic. More likely it was, "I hate being hungry. Let's trap food in one place." Either way, around 10,000 years ago, we stopped chasing our dinners and decided to grow them instead. And that, my friend, is when everything got way more complicated. See, on paper, farming sounds smart. Instead of running 20 miles barefoot to maybe catch a squirrel, you stay home, plant some seeds, water them, and wait. Easy, right? Well, no. First of all, early farming wasn't just about plants. It was a full-time gamble. You had to hope your seeds weren't duds, that the rains came, that the sun didn't cook your sprouts into toast, and that a goat wouldn't walk through your entire field at 2 just because it could. You traded hunting woolly mammoths for arguing with dirt. And sure, you could grow wheat and barley, but a diet of mostly carbs, with the occasional bean, didn't exactly scream nutrition, compared to the wild variety of fruits, meats, and nuts we used to enjoy. Farming made our plates dull. Ancient skeletons show it. Shorter statures, rotten teeth, signs of anemia. We basically invented agriculture and then immediately invented scurvy. Oh, and let's not forget pests. Once you have a barn full of grain, you also get rats, fleas, mold, and whatever nightmares crawl in on the wind. Civilization, as it turns out, is also an all-you-can-eat buffet for vermin. Living in one place also meant crowding. Suddenly, instead of travelling with your favourite 6 relatives, you were stuck in a mud house next to 400 people who all had opinions about how loud your goat was. Diseases loved this. One sneeze could travel faster than gossip. Speaking of which, agriculture invented drama. Now that we weren't roaming around, we had time to argue. Property lines became a thing, so did class systems. Someone had to organise planting schedules, someone else claimed they were in charge, and boom, congratulations, you've invented bureaucracy. There's a famous historical phrase that always makes me smile, though it's hotly debated. Farming made kings out of gardeners and servants out of warriors. It's not entirely wrong. With surplus food came power. With power came hierarchy. With hierarchy came the need to protect stuff. So we built walls, raised armies, created taxes, invented politics. Humanity went from eat or be eaten to sign here and wait in line. One odd fact. Some early granaries were also used as religious spaces, which kind of makes sense. If you've ever tried growing your own tomatoes, you know praying is part of the process. And here's the kicker. This change, this leap from wild to domestic, wasn't instant. It happened over generations. Some communities hunted, others farmed, some mixed both. And in between all of it were awkward conversations like, "Hey, want to help me chase that boar?" "No thanks. I'm growing lentils now." "What's a lentil?" "Bland, but dependable." Humans are funny like that. We crave stability, but we're built for chaos. Farming gave us calendars, and calendars gave us time, and time gave us anxiety. We began to mark our days, measure our losses, and remember our failures in neat little rows. But it wasn't all bad. Farming did give us roots, literally and emotionally. Families stayed together longer. Villages became communities. We developed architecture, weaving, pottery. People carved spoons. Someone probably invented the first apron. And you know what? We started writing. Writing began as a way to track crops and trade. Who owed what? Who gave whom how many goats? From that came stories, myths, literature. You're listening to this now, in part because someone 8,000 years ago needed to complain that their neighbour borrowed too much barley. It's humbling, isn't it? There's something beautiful about the idea that civilization started not with swords or scrolls, but with people kneeling in the mud, coaxing green shoots from the earth, hoping it would be enough. Of course, sometimes it wasn't. One bad harvest, one dry season, one plague of insects, and your entire village could starve. We see it in the archaeological record, mass graves, abandoned homes, crop storage pits full of spoiled grain. Farming was a risk, but humans? Oh, we doubled down, because deep down, we believe in tomorrow, even when today is awful, and yesterday was worse. We plant things, we plan meals, we bet on the sun. There's an old thought scrawled on a Sumerian tablet, or at least it could have been. Hope is what we sow when food is uncertain. So yes, Agriculture made life harder in many ways, but it also gave us poetry and gossip and the ability to sit still long enough to dream. And if dreaming is what separates us from the other mammals, then a field of wheat is humanity's first lullaby. Let me paint a picture for you. You're a tired farmer in 3200 BCE. Your knees ache, your back is wrecked, and your only hobby is staring at the sky and hoping it won't rain sideways. You've spent the last 3 seasons tending to a field of barley, praying the goats don't trample it again. You dream of lentils, mostly because they're the only thing in your pantry that hasn't gone mouldy. And just when things start looking up, locusts, again. Welcome to the ancient agricultural grind, where hope grows in rows and dies in batches. See, the invention of agriculture wasn't a one-time eureka moment. It was a messy, ongoing experiment in trial, error, and extremely poor pest control. And one of the side effects of this brave new world, besides back pain and food anxiety, was something a bit more unexpected. Toothaches. That's right. Farming ruined our smiles. Before agriculture, human diets were rich in variety: berries, nuts, meats, tubers. Our teeth had stuff to chew. Post-agriculture, it was wheat, barley, and more wheat, carbohydrate-rich, low-protein meals that stuck to teeth like sadness. The result? Cavities, enamel wear, and dental abscesses that could kill you. Think about that. A grain of barley could end your life. And don't even get me started on bread. Early bread was basically stone in loaf form, unleavened, dense, and full of grit from stone-ground flour. Eating it was an act of defiance against your molars. Archaeologists have found skulls from the Neolithic period with teeth worn down to the gum line. And if that weren't painful enough, infection could travel from your jaw into your bloodstream. With no antibiotics or floss, death by sandwich was suddenly a real possibility. And yet, we kept eating it. Why? Because we had no choice. Farming locked us in. Once you build a village around a field, you can't exactly go back to chasing gazelles and sleeping in trees, not unless you want to explain to the neighbours why you're hauling spears through their lentil patch. The big shift wasn't just physical, it was mental. For the first time in history, humans started obsessing about the future. You had to plan seasons in advance, store grain, prepare for famine. That mindset changed everything. We invented religion, partly to make sense of weather. We built gods to explain bad harvests. We prayed for rain and blamed demons for crop rot. Funny side note, one of the earliest known gods in Mesopotamia was Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. Apparently, even 5,000 years ago, people knew that if farming stressed you out, a drink might help. But the biggest problem? When the crops failed, because they failed. All the time. One unlucky drought, one late frost, and your entire food supply vanished. No Uber Eats, no backup rations, just hunger and regret. There's evidence in ancient skeletons, brittle bones, signs of malnutrition, stunted growth. We traded freedom of movement for the illusion of control. We weren't chasing mammoths anymore. We were chasing the weather forecast. Still, it wasn't all doom and lentils. Farming created something else. Memory. You remembered planting cycles. You remembered your neighbour's terrible advice from last season. You passed that knowledge to your kids, and they passed it on, sometimes accurately, sometimes hilariously wrong. That's how myth was born. The sun disappears, it's angry, the river floods, the gods are weeping. The wheat didn't grow, you didn't sacrifice enough chickens. People needed stories, they needed reasons, because life was hard, and randomness doesn't comfort the starving. So we built calendars, invented rituals, made up legends about wheat gods and moon maidens. Agriculture didn't just grow food, it grew culture. And still, underneath all that civilization was a raw truth. We were fragile. We lived in mud huts, got blisters from wooden ploughs, shared our beds with rodents. Every day was a dance with disease. A single infected foot could be fatal. A spoiled pot of grain could take out half a village. But here's the paradox. We were fragile, but never weak. Because despite all this, despite famine, disease, and early dentistry resembling medieval torture, we endured, and that's what amazes me. Not the scale of our suffering, but the scale of our persistence. We didn't just survive, We adapted. We didn't just adapt, we built. We didn't just build, we told stories about the building. Tonight's reflection. What hurts you may shape you, but what you share shapes the world. So next time you see a field of wheat, think of the people who planted it by hand, lost teeth to it, bled for it, and still knelt in reverence because, for all its flaws, it meant tomorrow. And you, lying here with a full belly and a screen that glows, are the echo of their prayers. You're in a field, guiding a wooden plough through damp, stubborn earth. The air smells like mud and goat. Your ox is named Blister because he gives them, not because he has them. You have about 4 teeth left and 2 of them hurt. You pause to wipe sweat from your brow and think, there must be a better way. And then a man rides past at lightning speed, firing arrows backwards from a horse without missing. You blink. He blinks back, and then he conquers your entire village. Welcome to the 13th century and welcome to the Mongols. If the Ice Age was a cold death and farming was a slow one, the Mongol invasions were a fast one. Very fast. Imagine waking up, stretching your back, and by lunch your hometown is a memory, and your relatives are rebranded as road gravel. Led by the charismatic and casually terrifying Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire swept across Asia and into Europe like a storm with hooves. By the time they were done, they'd built the largest contiguous land empire in human history and accidentally rewritten every map. You may have heard the name before, Genghis. A little hard to forget when historians estimate his campaigns led to the deaths of about 10% of the world's population. That's not poetic exaggeration, that's actual genocide, war, and famine all wrapped in fur-lined armour and saddlebags full of arrows. How did they do it? Mobility, intelligence, brutality. Mongol warriors could ride up to 100 miles a day, communicating with smoke signals and mounted couriers. Their archers could shoot accurately while galloping at full speed. Their tactics were advanced, coordinated, and terrifyingly efficient. But it wasn't just strength, it was strategy. They'd send scouts to gather intel for months. They used feigned retreats to draw enemies out. If a city surrendered, sometimes they spared it. If it didn't, they erased it. Quirky fact of the day, the Mongols occasionally catapulted diseased bodies over city walls. Yes, biological warfare in the 1200s. And while that sounds like something you'd hear in a horror movie, it actually happened, possibly even helping spread the Black Death later on, but we'll get to that delightful story soon. But here's the twist. The Mongols weren't just destroyers, they were also organisers. Once the blood dried and the cities stopped smouldering, they set up a remarkably well-run empire. They standardised weights and measures, encouraged trade, protected merchants, reopened the Silk Road and made passports a thing. Yes, passports. You could travel across continents under Mongol protection as long as you didn't make trouble. So while they were rewriting civilizations with fire and arrows, they were also building systems, postal services, relay stations, even religious tolerance for the most part. It's one of the great ironies of history. The same people who burned cities to ash also created safe passage for Buddhist monks and Islamic scholars. The people who stacked skulls like sandbags also hosted diplomatic envoys and fostered the exchange of ideas. It's almost like Genghis Khan said, let's tear everything down and then manage it better. And manage it they did. Their legal code, yasa, was harsh, but practical. Their leadership structure was brutal, but clear. Disloyalty was punished by death, but so was theft, so was stepping out of line in battle. The Mongols didn't tolerate chaos. They channeled it. And as much as modern historians debate the ethics and legacy of Genghis Khan, there's no question he left a mark. Genetically, too. Scientists estimate that 1 in every 200 men alive today carries his Y chromosome. So, someone had a busy retirement plan. Reflection for tonight. Civilization is a fragile mask. Beneath it, we're all just one hungry horseman away from rewriting the rules. You might think you're far from that chaos now, tucked in bed, sipping tea, but the echoes remain. The borders we defend, the cities we build, the fear we carry of things coming too fast. The Mongols remind us that history isn't slow and predictable. Sometimes it gallops in, armed and smiling. So next time your plans fall apart, take comfort. At least Genghis Khan isn't involved. Yet. Now imagine this. You're a merchant in a bustling medieval city, let's say somewhere in Italy. The year is 1347. You're selling cloth, maybe spices, maybe knock-off holy relics. Life is good, and then the ships arrive. Not the kind bringing cinnamon and gossip from the east. These ones bring something far less romantic. Rats, fleas, and death. You don't know it yet, but Europe is about to get hit with the deadliest biological ambush in history, the Black Death. If the Mongols were a sprinting terror, the plague was a silent tsunami, rolling across continents, slow enough to watch, fast enough to panic. It came from Central Asia, hitching a ride along the Silk Road, helped in no small part by, you guessed it, those incredibly efficient Mongol trade routes. Irony's got bite. By the time it reached Italy, it was already too late. The bacterium Yersinia pestis didn't care about class, creed, or charisma. It simply spread and killed. Symptoms began with chills, then fever, then swelling, lumps the size of eggs in your armpits and groin. These buboes gave the disease its name. Your skin might darken, you'd vomit, you'd bleed internally, you'd die, usually within 2 to 5 days. Doctors were helpless. They didn't know about germs. They believed in miasmas, bad air, and humours out of balance. So they prescribed leeches, flower-stuffed bird masks, and prayers. Mostly prayers. Quirky fact of the day. Those infamous plague doctor masks were filled with aromatic herbs because people thought good smells could push out the bad ones. Medieval science was 1 part faith, 2 parts vibes. The death toll? Astronomical. Between 30% to 60% of Europe's population died. Some towns lost everyone. Some were abandoned overnight. Corpses piled in streets. Mass graves became the norm. There weren't enough priests to give last rites. There weren't enough people to bury the dead. Economies collapsed. Trade froze. Nobles fled. And peasants, those who survived, found themselves weirdly empowered. With so many dead, labour became valuable. Wages rose. The social order shifted, if only slightly. But no one really won. Children died. Entire families disappeared. Artists painted death as a skeletal figure waltzing through village squares. Churches filled with weeping and suspicion, because when disaster hits, humans do what they've always done. Look for someone to blame. Jews, foreigners, women, strangers. Thousands were scapegoated and killed, not by plague, but by people. And yet, somehow, people adapted. Survivors grew immune. Some towns locked down and succeeded. Quarantine, an idea born from desperate port cities like Venice, actually worked. They forced ships to sit offshore for 40 giorni, 40 days before docking. 40. Quarantine. That's where the word comes from. It's strange. How familiar this feels, right? Symptoms, misinformation, blame, panic, masks, isolation. We've seen it. Recently. Because disease doesn't care about the century. It just is. And in every age, we respond the same way. First with denial, then with chaos, and finally with stories. Stories of survival, of resilience, of the old woman who lived when everyone else didn't, of the child who sang while the world burned, of the man who walked through empty streets and came back with hope. Here's your reflection for tonight. Plague doesn't just kill bodies, it strips illusions. What's left is truth. And here's a softer truth. Those who survived the Black Death weren't the strongest, or smartest, or luckiest. They were just there, still breathing, still trying, still holding hands at funerals and whispering to the stars. Please not this one. One odd note. Some scholars believe the Black Death helped trigger the Renaissance. With so many dead, the living began to rethink things. Life felt shorter, urgency bloomed. So they painted, they wrote, they broke rules. Tragedy sometimes makes room for beauty, not because it should, but because we have no other choice. So tonight, if you feel overwhelmed, remember, your ancestors got through this, without medicine, without science, without TikTok. They endured the unspeakable and somehow kept speaking. And you're the echo of that perseverance, a living reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, someone always turns the page. The dust didn't just settle, it lingered. After the Mongols had galloped through history like a hurricane on horseback, The world was left clutching at its torn edges. Entire cities were gone. Populations decimated. But something strange happened in the silence after the storm. People started talking, because after trauma, humans don't just rebuild, they retell. The stories spread, faster than arrows. Did you hear what they did to Nishapur? They boiled princes alive in bronze bulls. No, my cousin said they spared poets. Were any of those things true? Maybe, maybe not. But in the absence of certainty, legend fills the gap like sand in a broken jar. See, the Mongol invasions didn't just destroy kingdoms, they rearranged them. Trade routes shifted, power maps blurred, whole cultures were uprooted and replanted like stubborn weeds in new soil. And from that forced migration came, unexpectedly, connection. Think about it. Before the Mongols, a merchant from Venice had no idea what a Tangut monk thought about the afterlife. After the Mongols, well, they were probably arguing about it over fermented mare's milk at a caravan stop halfway to Samarkand. It's debatable among historians, but some claim the Mongols created one of the earliest forms of globalization. Not out of love, mind you. More like, here's your new postal system, and if you mess with it, we'll mail you your own ears. But it worked. The YAM system, their relay courier network, was absurdly efficient. Messengers could ride across Eurasia faster than some people today get mail delivered across town. Along those routes came more than letters, ideas, inventions, diseases, gossip, recipes. If you've ever wondered how dumplings and ravioli ended up weirdly similar, thank Genghis. And here's the oddest twist of all. The Mongols, for all their homicidal enthusiasm, were actually religiously tolerant. They didn't care what god you worshipped. So long as your taxes arrived on time and you didn't revolt, a simple system, really. In fact, the great Khans often employed scholars from multiple faiths, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Confucians, to debate at court. Imagine a TED Talk, but with yaks outside and the lingering fear that a wrong answer might result in light dismemberment. And it wasn't just scholars who moved. Craftsmen, engineers, entertainers, people with skills were often spared and resettled. Your hometown might be on fire, but if you were really good at pottery, congrats. You just got relocated to the Mongol capital. It was brutal, yes, but weirdly meritocratic. There's a saying, possibly apocryphal. The Mongols didn't care where you came from, only what you could do once you got there. That's either terrifying or inspiring, depending on how good you are with a bow. Now let's talk about the people left behind. The survivors. Imagine watching your world burn. Friends gone, temples razed, entire dialects erased. What do? You remember. You rebuild. You whisper your language to your children in secret. You write your poems in the margins of borrowed alphabets. You make meaning out of what remains. It's in this post-Mongol silence that some of the world's greatest art bloomed. Persian miniatures, Chinese landscape scrolls, the rise of European Gothic architecture, the echo of loss, painted in cathedral ceilings and etched into calligraphy. Grief, processed slowly, becomes beauty. And yet, not everything was poetic. In some places, the social fabric never quite stitched itself back together. Entire cities became ghost towns. Trade dried up. The once bustling Silk Road, in places, it faded into dust, used only by sheep and stories. Here's a fun fact that feels too ironic to be real. In many places, the Mongol invasions improved infrastructure. They built roads, dug wells, standardized weights and measures. Imagine being the guy in charge of toll booths after the apocalypse. Yes, I know everyone's dead, but do you have exact change? It's hard to hold all this at once. The violence and the progress, the destruction and the strange seeds it planted. That's the thing about history. It never fits neatly into boxes labeled good or bad. It's messy, it overlaps, it haunts and heals in equal measure. And maybe that's why we keep telling the stories. To make sense of the madness. To laugh. A little. Because the alternative is weeping into your goat stew. To remember that even when everything falls apart, language, borders, family trees, there's still someone sitting in the ruins, sketching patterns in the dust and imagining what comes next. So the next time you hear hoofbeats on the horizon, literal or metaphorical, remember this. even after the Mongols, people planted flowers. It sailed in on ships and rode on rats. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe like an unwanted guest who eats everything in your pantry and then burns down the house, carried by fleas, living on rodents, and catching rides in the folds of travellers' cloaks. It spread so fast that people thought it was magic or punishment. Spoiler, it was neither. Just bacteria. Yersinia pestis, to be exact. A microscopic nightmare with a flair for drama. Imagine this. You're in a medieval village. It's a decent day. The chickens are clucking. Your neighbour's yelling about cheese again. Then someone sneezes, and 3 days later, they're dead. And then their cousin, and then their cousin's goat. Within a week, the whole village feels like it's holding its breath and forgetting how to exhale. The symptoms were terrifying. Swollen lymph nodes, they called them buboes, blackened skin, vomiting blood, and worst of all, it didn't care who you were, rich, poor, holy, wicked. Everyone looked the same when they turned grey. No one knew what caused it. Theories ranged from bad air to angry stars to those people over there who look slightly different. And of course, when confused, humans often turn violent. Pogroms, witch hunts, and scapegoating became the second pandemic. To cope, people did what humans always do when the world breaks. They got weird. Flagellants marched through towns whipping themselves, hoping to earn divine forgiveness through bruises. Others threw wild parties, reasoning that if death was coming, it might as well catch them drunk and dancing. Some locked themselves indoors, inventing early quarantine and possibly sourdough. Let's not forget the doctors, or rather, the plague doctors, long black robes, leather gloves, and that infamous beaked mask, stuffed with herbs and flowers. The idea, sweet smells could drive out the miasma. In practice, they just looked like goth birds auditioning for a horror movie. And yet, amid the horror, people recorded, wrote poems, kept journals, painted visions of death dancing through villages. This wasn't just an event, it was memory, burned into culture. Roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's population died. That's not a statistic. That's your entire street, your favourite bakery, your school, empty, the bells ringing with no one left to hear them. But, and here's the twisted thing, afterward, society changed. Labourers were suddenly in demand, wages rose, some serfs walked off the land and never looked back. Towns rewrote their laws, art turned more introspective, death, once a far-off concept, became an everyday muse. One debatable phrase from history says, "Without the plague, there would be no Renaissance." It's a bold claim, and likely oversimplified, but not entirely wrong. When mortality becomes casual, people start to rethink priorities. What is worth drawing? Singing, building, and most importantly, and who is worth listening to? Here's a quirky fact. Some people believed carrying a bouquet at all times could ward off the plague. Sound familiar? Yep. Ring Around the Rosie. Might just be a plague-era nursery rhyme. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes. We all fall down. Yikes. But even through this nightmare, humans adapted. Cities developed public health boards. Quarantine laws were drafted. Ports were monitored. It was slow, clumsy, imperfect. But it was the beginning of something new. The idea that maybe, just maybe, we could fight back, not with superstition, but with systems. Still, for the average medieval person, the plague wasn't a policy issue. It was a smell in the air, a missing neighbour, a silence in the church, and for the survivors, the world felt fragile, haunted. There's something in that grief, something we still carry, a shared shadow, a reminder that life isn't promised, that the line between breath and memory is thinner than we think. So light a candle, not for fear, but for connection. You're here because someone made it through the darkness with a story in their pocket and enough hope to try again. If death wore a mask in last part, then in this part it wears a smile and a beak full of posies. Welcome to the era of coping mechanisms and floral deception. After the Black Death, life didn't so much go back to normal as it did wobble forward with a limp and haunted expression. The living carried the weight of absence like a second skin. The survivors had seen too much, entire families gone, streets lined with carts of the dead, the smell of rot embedded in memory. So they did what humans do when the world feels too heavy. They got creative. Art became weird. Beautiful, but weird. Skeletons dancing with farmers, virgins riding unicorns, saints with vacant eyes floating through gold-leaf heavens. Death was no longer a distant stranger. It was your annoying roommate who never moved out. And yet, people still painted, still sang, still hoped. Doctors continued to wear the plague masks, but they upgraded their look. Longer beaks, more herbs, fancier belts with odd tools dangling like goth accessories. These weren't just physicians. They were walking symbols of a society trying very hard to pretend it had things under control. Meanwhile, cities started making rules. Venice was one of the first to implement official quarantine, 40 days at sea before you could dock. 40 giorni. That's where the word comes from. Bureaucracy, born of biohazard. Some towns even created plague houses, marked homes where infected families were locked in with food shoved through the door. Effective? Sort of. Ethical? Let's just say the Yelp reviews would have been brutal. But here's where things twist again. People found love. Amid the ashes and fear, romance bloomed like a weed in cracked stone. Letters, poems, secret meetings behind barns. If you've ever wondered whether it's possible to flirt during an apocalypse, oh yes, and with flourish. And the clothes. Wild. If you survived a pandemic, you were going to wear something loud. Bright colours, tall hats, excessive buttons. It was as if the entire continent collectively shouted, "I'm still here," via fabric. There's a theory, arguable but compelling, that the trauma of plague reshaped European identity. People became more individualistic, more sceptical of authority, more likely to question whether that bishop really needed a third gold chalice. Universities changed. Medicine shifted from prayers to protocols. Trade rebounded, fast. When half your workforce is gone, everyone left gets a raise. Serfs walked away from their lords. New cities sprang up. Guilds grew in power. Knowledge, like a stubborn weed, kept pushing through the cracks. One fascinating detail. In some towns, bells rang daily to remind people to pray for the dead. Imagine that. Every sunset. A low clang echoing through empty streets. A sonic reminder that time passes, that grief lingers, that memory matters. Let's talk about memory. Some survivors kept journals, scraps of insight in cramped handwriting. A merchant noting which towns were safe. A widow recording dreams of her children. These fragments survive today, whispering across centuries that we were here. Humans forget, but we also record, in walls, in songs, in the margins of dusty books. You, listening to this now, are part of that chain, a heartbeat echoing back toward theirs. There's a medieval expression that sums it all up. Memento mori. Remember you must die, but it wasn't morbid, it was grounding, a reminder that time is limited, which makes it precious, which makes you precious. And here's your quirky fact for this chapter. Some plague survivors wore amulets made from toad bones. Why? Because someone, somewhere, decided that frogs absorb disease energy. Dubious science, excellent folklore. In the end, what amazes me most is not the death toll but the creativity that rose from it. We dance with ghosts, we draw them, name them, joke with them. Maybe that's our secret power, not just surviving but mythologizing survival. So here's to the masks, the bells, the too bright coats, to the poems scribbled in plague margins, to the tiny, desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, something beautiful could still be written. You're alive. That's the whole story. 74,000 years ago, Earth exhaled and nearly ended us all. The Toba supervolcano, nestled in what is now Indonesia, didn't just erupt, it exploded, violently, catastrophically, with a roar that echoed across hemispheres and a plume of ash so thick, the sun forgot how to shine. This wasn't a Mount St. Helens situation, or even a Pompeii. This was a planetary event, an extinction flirtation, one volcano, one moment, and suddenly, Earth was under new management. Ash, acid, rain, and deep, deep cold. Scientists estimate that the eruption launched over 670 cubic miles of material into the sky. To put that in perspective, Imagine burying the entire United States under 15 feet of ash. That's how much we're talking about. The result? A volcanic winter, where sunlight was blocked, global temperatures plunged by as much as 27 degrees, 15 degrees, and ecosystems everywhere collapsed like overcooked soufflés. Photosynthesis stopped, plants died, animals starved, and humans? Well, we became ghosts wandering through a frozen dream. Now imagine you're one of the few Homo sapiens alive at the time. You were already just scraping by, hunting with rocks, trying not to get eaten by the dark, and now the sky turns grey, the trees die, and the rivers freeze over. It was the ultimate bad week. Food vanished, prey migrated or died, plants withered, water sources froze. There was no concept of stockpiling or emergency rations. If you didn't move or adapt, you were gone. No second chances. And yet, we didn't vanish. Genetic evidence suggests that our species was reduced to fewer than 3,000 individuals. That's less than a packed high school auditorium. The human race, a hair away from disappearing entirely, clung on by its frostbitten fingernails. That's called a genetic bottleneck. And if you've ever looked at someone and thought, why does this stranger feel weirdly familiar? Well, you're not wrong. We're all very distant cousins, courtesy of volcanic roulette. But what fascinates me isn't just that we survived. It's how, somehow, in the face of freezing darkness, starvation, and extinction, tiny groups of people managed to find shelter, share warmth, ration food, and whisper hope into each other's ears. They kept fire going. They kept language alive. They kept each other alive. There's a theory, still debated but beautifully poetic, that this near-death experience pushed our brains into overdrive, that the stress of survival made us smarter, more social, more innovative, that music, storytelling, and spiritual belief didn't come from luxury, but from sheer desperation. When you sit in the dark for years, you start to imagine light. Eventually the sky cleared. Slowly, the ash settled, plants returned, rivers melted, and those few thousand stubborn humans emerged, not just alive, but forever changed. The trauma lived on. In our DNA, in our myths, in our need to gather around fires and tell stories about things we almost didn't survive. It wasn't just about endurance, it was about identity. Maybe that's where the idea of humanity truly begins. Not with tools or fire, but with memory, with the act of saying, we were there, we stayed. And from there, something strange began. People didn't just survive the darkness, they grew from it. The early roots of migration, culture, innovation, they all follow that trauma. In a world stripped bare, even a handful of seeds can become a forest again. Some anthropologists speculate that the mythologies of global floods, gods angry with humankind, or long nights with no dawn may all trace back to Toba. Maybe the memory lasted longer than the ash. Maybe it echoed in lullabies, warnings, the shape of firelit stories told to children whose faces reflected flames, and fear. There's an old quote, "Origin unknown, the stars are never so bright as when the world is dark." The Toba eruption wasn't just a disaster, it was a crucible, a terrible, transformative silence from which our kind re-emerged, a little more fragile and a lot more aware. Quirky fact time. Some geologists believe the ash from Toba reached as far as East Africa. Imagine that. A single volcanic scream, heard around the world. Ash in the lungs of mammals who would one day write symphonies. So tonight, as you rest in your warm bed, maybe with a snack nearby and the hum of electricity around you, know this. You are here because someone, 74,000 years ago, kept a fire alive in the rain. Because someone else gave their portion of roots to a weaker friend. Because even in the worst winter Earth has ever known, kindness still burned. You are not just a survivor. You are the child of survivors of survivors of survivors, and your breath is their victory. We came out of the ash, blinking, after Toba, after the cold, after the silence. We began to walk, not as wanderers, but as a people chasing tomorrow. You can trace our footprints in the mud of ancient lakes, in the soot of old fires, in the bones of animals long extinct. That was us, our early ancestors, restless, hungry, hopeful. It's strange how survival makes you curious. As the earth warmed again, our small population began to spread, east, west, north, south, across grasslands and rivers and into mountains. Every new place brought danger, yes, but also discovery. New foods, new animals, new weather. We met the world like toddlers opening kitchen drawers. Everything was a mystery, and most of it could kill us. Still, we explored. We crossed continents. We built canoes and hugged coastlines. We climbed ridges and stared at stars. And everywhere we went, we brought fire and stories, tools and songs. Language adapted to every cave and cliff. And slowly, very slowly, we began to become more than survivors. We became creators. There are cave paintings in Spain and Indonesia, tens of thousands of years old, showing hands pressed against stone, red, ochre, black. Just silhouettes, but hauntingly human. A child might have pressed their palm against that wall, someone scared, someone proud, and said, "Look, I was here." And we believed them. That, to me, is where humanity deepens, not in the spear or the harvest, but in the mark, the proof that you mattered. And the marks grew, from symbols to maps, from chants to poems, from firelight stories to systems of belief. We looked at the sky and didn't just name the stars, we asked them questions. There's something deeply funny about this moment in time. We had just avoided extinction, and now we were inventing gods, making shrines, wondering about purpose. You'd think our first concern would be food, but no, we wanted meaning. There's an old joke among anthropologists. Give a human a sharp stick and they'll hunt. Give them time to think and they'll invent guilt. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were remembering and dreaming and mourning. Burials became ritualistic. Some graves held tools, ornaments, or beads. One even held a body cradled in red ochre, arms folded gently, as if sleeping. We weren't just disposing of the dead. We were honoring them. And that means something had changed. Love, grief, maybe even faith, all born from fire and famine and freezing nights when we thought the sun might never return. Quirky fact of the day, archaeologists once found an ancient flute carved from the femur of a bird, over 40,000 years old. It plays a scale, which means someone, somewhere, had time and inspiration not just to survive, but to compose. We've been trying to make music in the dark for a very long time, and that's the lesson here, isn't it? We weren't meant to dominate this planet. We weren't the strongest or the fastest. We couldn't fly or roar or run 60 miles an hour, but we remembered, we loved, we imagined, and we shared. When the world tried to erase us, we picked up charcoal and drew our names on the wall. So if you've ever felt small, or lost, or uncertain, you're not alone. That feeling? That's the very thing that kept us human. And in the quiet of the night, if you listen closely, maybe you'll hear the footsteps of those who came before you. Not as ghosts, but as echoes. You are not the beginning, but you are a continuation. And they are proud. We should have died. That's not melodrama. It's math, probability, logic, common sense. When you line up the things we've lived through, the ice, the heat, the teeth, the famine, the war, the plague, the volcano, it doesn't make sense that we're still here. But here we are. And that begs the question, what is it about us? What made our fragile, flammable, emotionally volatile species so good at not dying? Some say it's adaptability. Others say it's collaboration. Personally, I think it's because we're absurdly stubborn and weirdly hopeful. We're the only animal that, after watching our friend get eaten by a lion, draws a picture of it, tells a story about it, makes a joke about it, and then goes back out there with a sharper stick. We don't just survive, we make meaning out of survival. And the stories we've told, they're not always accurate, but they've kept us going. Every legend, every myth, every campfire ghost tale is a scar turned into a song. There's something almost magical about the way humans process trauma. We don't just record what happened. We turn it into art. We exaggerate. We twist. We turn pain into metaphor, danger into drama. It's our way of biting back at the universe. And that tendency, It shows up everywhere. A collapsed cave becomes the home of angry mountain spirits. A river flood becomes the wrath of a forgotten god. A famine, clearly the result of someone not performing the correct ritual. It's not science, but it's something older. The need to explain, even when we don't understand. And over time, those explanations became tradition, culture. They stitched us together like threads in a much-abused patchwork blanket. Here's an old expression I like. History is the story of what hurt us and how we sang about it. And oh, have we been hurt? But we've also learned. Those cave painters, they weren't just making art, they were teaching. Here's how the bison moves. Here's where the herd goes. Here's the spear that works. Those early songs, they carried warnings. Don't eat this root. Don't go past that ridge. Beware of the fire. We survived because we remembered, and we remembered because we shared. And that brings us to something rarely celebrated, the art of almost dying. Because let's face it, most of human history has been one long game of, oops, that was close. The near misses, the we almost didn't make it moments, the accidental victories and lucky breaks, the weird mushrooms that didn't kill us, the animal tracks we learned to follow. Our ancestors weren't superhuman. They were scared, tired, wrong a lot, but they paid attention, they learned. And when they got things right, even by accident, they passed it on. That's how we built memory, not through perfection, but through repetition, through story. Quirky fact, some African tribes have oral genealogies going back 30 generations, maintained entirely by memory. No books, just people speaking names in the correct order. That's commitment, that's reverence, that's survival as ceremony. So the next time you make a mistake and think, well, that was dumb. Remember, humanity is built on dumb things that almost killed us, followed by smarter people saying, let's not do that again. It's a miracle we're here. But maybe miracle's the wrong word. Maybe we're just really good at almost dying. Let's talk about your bones. Not metaphorically, your actual bones. Because hidden inside them is a story. Not just about you, but about every person who came before you. Every fall they didn't take. Every illness they survived. Every child they raised just long enough for them to raise another. You're not just someone who exists. You're an accumulation. Biologically speaking, your DNA is a layered cake of stubbornness, mutation, and coincidence. You are the result of a million microscopic decisions. Which gene got passed on, which one didn't, which body fought off a parasite, which one starved at the wrong moment. But let's zoom in deeper. The calcium in your teeth probably came from a fish that swam in water filtered by a rock that formed when a mountain eroded after a volcanic blast millions of years ago. That mountain, it might have once been walked by a creature that looked up at a sky full of predators and thought, nope, everything is connected. Every bit of you has a lineage. We often say things like you carry your ancestors within you, but we forget. That's not a metaphor. You literally do, in your blood type, your immune system, your earlobes, the way your body reacts to altitude, even how your liver processes sugar. These aren't accidents. They're inheritance. And inheritance isn't just biology. It's memory, behavior, instinct. The reason your body flinches when it hears a sudden loud noise, probably because, for thousands of years, loud noises often meant sharp teeth. We're walking archives, not dusty libraries, but living, breathing, constantly updating exhibits of survival. And it's not just in what we have, it's in what we lack. Wisdom teeth that don't fit, appendixes that do nothing, goosebumps when we're cold, all leftovers from versions of us who lived very different lives. You are a museum of upgrades and mistakes, and still, somehow, it works. Because behind every clumsy adaptation is a truth. You were never meant to be perfect, just possible. Here's a favourite reflection of mine. You are the improbable result of everything not going completely wrong. And that's worth marvelling at. Now, let's pull back from the microscopic, zoom out, look at the whole structure. You, sitting here, wherever you are, listening to this, with a heart that beats in sync with a brain that overthinks, and a gut that sometimes knows better than either. You are a miracle of systems. And those systems, nervous, circulatory, skeletal, aren't just clever, they're ancient, crafted through catastrophe, refined by famine, frost, and failure. Your lungs remember mountains, your skin remembers sunlight filtered through leaves, your spine remembers trees. You're not a newcomer, you are continuation. That thought can feel heavy, or incredibly freeing, because if you are built of everything that survived, then you're more resilient than you think. And if your ancestors could crawl out of glacial caves, walk across continents, raise children during plagues, and learn to sing with bruised throats, then surely you can make it through this week. Quirky fact? Some archaeologists believe humans began burying their dead not out of hygiene, but out of reverence, because they sensed that the body, even in stillness, was sacred, a vessel of stories, a vessel of ears. So treat yours kindly, feed it, rest it, move it, marvel at it. It's not just yours. It belongs to everyone who ever tried and failed and tried again so that you could sit here now and wonder why your knees crack when you stand up. You're a symphony of echoes, a cathedral of bone and breath. And that's not poetry, it's science. This is it. The last stretch. Not the end of the world, of course. Just the end of the story we've been whispering together, curled in the shadows of everything we almost didn't survive. If you've made it this far, know this. You've just wandered through thousands of years in a few quiet minutes. You've walked with mammoth hunters. You've squatted in smoke-filled huts with coughing farmers. You've heard bells ring over empty villages. You've watched cities burn and flowers grow in the ashes. And now, you're here and you're still breathing. So let's slow it down. You're not here by accident. You're not just the result of biology or time or lucky genes. You're the consequence of courage. 1,000 unnamed people who refused to lie down, who stood up when it hurt, who tried again when everything screamed no. You are what happens when survival gets creative, and that creativity is still in you. It shows up in the way you hum while cooking, or the stories you tell when the power goes out. It's in the shape of lullabies, in the instinct to hold someone's hand when they're afraid, in the little laugh you let out when you make a mistake and know. Somehow, you'll figure it out anyway. Tonight, we've talked about death, disasters, the cold, the dark, but let's not forget, we've also talked about art, and fire, and laughter, and love. This story wasn't about endings. It was about continuity. It was about the fact that the most ordinary thing you can do, keep going, is the most extraordinary act of all. So before we go, here's something soft to carry with you. You're the reason your ancestors fought mammoths. You're the answer to a question someone asked under a sky full of stars and fear. You're the proof that the human spirit isn't a metaphor. It's real, it's messy, it's hungry, and it survives. And now, take a deep breath. The night is still. Your room is warm. Somewhere, a refrigerator hums like an ancient lullaby. You are safe. You are here. And the world, chaotic and cruel as it may sometimes seem, has brought you all the way to this moment. Let the story settle like dust. Let the silence wrap around you like a familiar blanket. Let yourself drift. Tomorrow will come, but tonight, just rest. You're made of every flame that didn't go out. You're made of every voice that didn't fall silent. You're made of every love that refused to die in the dark, and that is enough. Chapter 1. Before names. Before fire. Long before nations. Long before even language. There was only silence. The kind of silence that doesn't lack sound, but lacks memory. There were no names, no history, only motion, heat, time. Around 3.8 billion years ago, under a pale sun and a sky still uncertain of its shape, molecules stirred restlessly in warm, mineral-rich seas. What came next wasn't magic. It was accident, repeated with such elegance that it began to look like design. Out of those primordial waters, life blinked into being, not with a roar, but a ripple. Single-celled organisms pulsing toward light. Cells swallowed other cells. The ancestors of all plants and animals were built on cooperation before they ever tasted competition. And so, slowly, through countless ages, complexity emerged. Skip forward to a quieter miracle. Around 6 million years ago, somewhere in the green mosaic of East Africa, a primate stood up, briefly, wobbly, but upright nonetheless. They were not humans yet, only creatures inching towards something new. Bipedal, curious, fragile. Over millions of years, they became many things: Australopithecus, then Homo habilis, then Homo erectus, who learned to tame fire and walk beyond the continent of their birth. Fire, a line in the sand, a revolution in warmth, safety, and hunger. With fire came stories, first told by the dance of flame in the eyes of a child, watching meat roast for the first time. These were humans not yet bound by written language, but they remembered through rhythm and gesture. They carved animals into cave walls and painted their myths onto stone. And then came us, Homo sapiens, not the strongest, nor the fastest, but we learned to remember what others forgot. Around 70,000 years ago, we began imagining things that weren't there: gods, rules, futures, regrets. This was not biology, it was belief. Our minds, so fragile, were now dangerous. Now, we could cooperate in groups of thousands, as long as we all believed the same story. We built tribes, we shared rituals, we buried our dead with beads and tools, hoping the soul followed. Meanwhile, our cousins, Neanderthals, thrived in Europe. They had thick brows, massive strength, and children who died young in ice and hunger. They too made tools. They too buried their dead. But slowly, they vanished. We didn't kill them. We outlasted them, because we whispered stories into the firelight, and those stories became scaffolding for something grander than mere survival. They became identity. It's hard to say exactly when history began, because history is not what happened, but what was recorded, but civilization. That began not in a king's palace or an empire's court, but in the quiet place where someone first asked, "What if we stay here?" Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, in the cradle between rivers, we planted seeds and stayed to watch them grow. This was the moment the world changed, not with conquest, but with care. From the first cultivated grain to the domesticated dog curled beside a hearth, humanity chose permanence. We left behind the wild freedom of the hunt for the predictability of harvests. It was not just food, it was the beginning of a pattern. Homes, villages, walls, temples, calendars, gods with names, a life that extended beyond a single lifetime. And though we'd lose some of our wildness, we'd gain something else: time. Time to think, to argue, to plan, to remember. Time to build a world that could outlive us. And so begins the tale of humans no longer just surviving, but becoming the architects of memory. Chapter 2. Grain and Gods. It began not with a war, or a king, or even a calendar, but with a question: what if we never leave? 10,000 years ago, somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, a child pressed their hands into soft, wet soil. Nearby, elders scattered seeds, barley, wheat, emmer, and marked the sky for signs of rain. For the first time in our story, food was not something you chased, it was something you waited for. Agriculture was not just a new way of eating, it was a new way of being. With grain came surplus, and with surplus came power. The wild became tamed, rivers were bent to will, and people, for the first time, had the audacity to expect tomorrow. In the city of Uruk, baked from the sun-dried clay of Mesopotamia, the first cities emerged like thought-made stone. They didn't rise overnight. They grew, like a coral reef, layer upon layer of hopes, fears, debts, and births. Each temple to Inanna or Enlil was more than a place of worship. It was a declaration that humans could organize themselves not just by need, but by meaning. With cities came hierarchies, priests, scribes, warriors, laborers. Not everyone had to farm anymore. Some were freed to observe the stars, to invent cuneiform, to record debts and dreams on tablets of mud hardened by time. Egypt, further west, gazed not into ziggurats, but into the sky. The Nile, eternal, mysterious, offered rhythm and reassurance. Here, they built tombs not just for kings, but for gods walking as men. The pyramids were not monuments to death, but blueprints of immortality. In granite and limestone, Egyptians etched a single cosmic hope. Life continues. In the east, Another world whispered its own version of permanence. The Indus Valley cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro rose with astonishing symmetry. Grid-like streets, sophisticated drainage, public baths, a civilization obsessed not with dominance, but with balance. Their script remains undeciphered, their kings unknown, their wars, if any, silent. Yet their presence still breathes in brick and water, order and mystery. What united all these early civilizations was not location, language, or leadership. It was a deeper instinct that chaos must be answered with ritual, that change must be marked with symbol, that life, in its brevity, could be extended through legacy. And so we built. Not just with stone, but with story. We told ourselves that the floods came because the gods were angry, that the harvest came because the gods were pleased, that kings ruled by divine mandate, and to question them was to question the sun itself. It worked. Fear and faith are excellent foundations for society. But there was more. In temples and hearths, something began to stir beyond superstition. People started recording more than crops and taxes. They recorded questions. What is justice? What happens after death? Who decides the shape of the world? We do not know the names of those first thinkers. They left behind no manifestos, no declarations, no portraits, only symbols, only structures. But their presence is unmistakable, alive in every law, every myth, every seed that grew because someone dared to stay. Civilization was not inevitable. It was chosen, repeated, reinforced, and not without cost. With settlement came disease, with property came theft, with walls came war, and yet, despite famine, flood, and fire, people stayed. Why? Because in staying, they built something we'd never had before, memory that could last beyond a single life. In grain, we learned patience. In temples, we learned awe. In kings, we learned obedience. And in gods, we learned ourselves. The Neolithic Revolution wasn't just a shift in technology. It was the awakening of the idea that the world could be shaped, and so could we. By the end of this age, cities had become centres of trade. Temples were stockpiles of both grain and belief, and humans, so recently just clever apes, had begun to dream of permanence. And so, from the whisper of wheat came the roar of empire. A world of rulers and rules was about to rise, and with it, the first true infrastructure of power, law. Chapter 3, Laws on Stone, Power in Heaven. Every civilization, sooner or later, must answer a dangerous question. What happens when someone breaks the rules? The answer in the earliest days was simple: retaliation. But as communities grew into cities, and cities into kingdoms, vengeance no longer scaled. You could not run a civilization on blood feuds and personal grudges. So, humanity invented something radical, the idea of public justice. In Babylon, around 1750 BCE, a king named Hammurabi etched his answer into stone, not in whispers or parchment, but in basalt, black as night. His code was not the first set of laws, but it was one of the most enduring. 282 rules, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, stood tall for all to see. An eye for an eye, but also wages, theft, contracts, inheritance. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about precedent. This was a new idea. That law should be known, predictable, and written, not whispered by priests or enforced by whim. Across the world, similar awakenings stirred. In ancient China, the mandate of heaven emerged, a celestial endorsement for rulers. As long as they were just, if floods or famine struck, it was a sign the ruler had lost this divine approval. Thus, rebellion could be framed not as treason, but as cosmic correction. Dynasties rose and fell by this logic, from the Zhou to the Tang, and while the East spoke of harmony and mandate, the West experimented with something else: voice. In Athens, around the 5th century BCE, a noisy, messy, brilliant thing was born. Democracy. Housias, male citizens, not all people, gathered in the agora to argue, vote, accuse, defend. It was slow, it was biased, but it was revolutionary. Nearby. The Roman Republic created the 12 Tables, a legal code engraved and displayed in the forum. Law, once the domain of the patricians, was now visible to the plebeians. This was power, not of swords, but of symbols. You could appeal, you could cite, you could protest. Even the most tyrannical emperors later had to pay lip service to Roman law. That's how strong the idea had become. Law, across all these lands, served multiple purposes. It was a mirror, reflecting what people valued. It was a shield, protecting those who knew how to wield it. And it was a chain, binding the weak more tightly than the strong. But behind every law stood a greater question. Where did authority come from? In some places, it was the gods. In others, it was reason. Sometimes, it was simply tradition wrapped in gold, yet all shared a belief that order was fragile, and that to keep it, humans needed more than instinct. They needed it as institution. The first states were not defined by borders but by behaviors. A state could tax, a state could conscript, a state could imprison. And most critically, a state could claim monopoly on legitimate violence. This shift was monumental. Now, killing was not always murder. It could be called justice, or war, or sacrifice. And so we built courts, bureaucracies, archives. And though the writing materials changed from clay to papyrus to parchment, the impulse was the same, to preserve control. Still, for all this formality, power remained deeply personal. Kings ruled by charisma, conquest, or divine right. Their bodies were the state. Their death could trigger collapse. In time, the idea of law would outgrow even kings. But in this era, law and ruler were still entwined. Authority was embodied, and that body wore a crown. Yet even in this age, cracks appeared. Philosophers like Confucius in China or Socrates in Athens asked dangerous things. What is virtue? What is justice beyond obedience? Can a bad law still be legal? They weren't just asking, they were remembering. That law is not divine, it is human. And anything human can change. So as the great civilizations expanded, conquered, and codified, a quiet truth echoed beneath their marble halls and dragon thrones. That real power isn't just in ruling. It's in convincing others that your rule is right. And thus, the age of law gave birth to something more enduring than empire. Ideology. Chapter 4. Empires and the Art of Conquest. By now, humans had learned to write, to build, to govern. But one lesson still eluded them: how to share. Power, once confined to kings and councils, now sought expansion, not just over people, but over land, trade, time itself. The age of conquest had begun. Let's begin with a spark, a defiant run across a Greek plain. 490 BCE, a Persian armada loomed on the horizon. Their empire, vast and golden, had swallowed Babylon, Egypt, and parts of India. Now it sought Greece. At Marathon, Athenian hoplites stood their ground, and one, a messenger, ran 26 miles to deliver the news, then died. A story retold forever in marathons, not just of distance, but of defiance. The Persian wars continued, Salamis, Plataea, but something had changed. The Greeks, fractured and quarrelsome, had glimpsed the power of unity, and from that flicker, a storm. Alexander of Macedon, son of Philip, student of Aristotle, marched east in 334 BCE. In less than a decade, he would conquer Persia, reach India, and weep, because no worlds remained to conquer. But conquest was not just territory, it was transmission wherever Alexander went. So did Greek language, sculpture, myth. In Egypt, he founded Alexandria, a city of scholars and scrolls. In Bactria, his soldiers married local women. It was not peace, but it was fusion. This was the Hellenistic Age, a time when East and West kissed, clashed, and combined. Meanwhile, in the West, another power stirred. Rome, first a monarchy, then a republic, began swallowing neighbours through treaties, treachery, and sheer persistence. By the 1st century BCE, it had grown from a scrappy hilltop town to an empire stretching from Scotland to Syria. Its genius was not just in war, but in infrastructure. Roads, aqueducts, laws, baths, Rome built not just for the present, but for permanence. They offered conquered peoples Roman citizenship, Roman gods, Roman roads. Resistance was met with legions. Submission was rewarded with Latin and legal codes. But power breeds rivals. In China, the Qin dynasty rose under the iron will of Qin Shi Huang. He crushed warring states, standardized currency and script, and ordered the construction of the first Great Wall. His tomb held rivers of mercury and 1,000 terracotta soldiers, frozen in formation, still standing guard today. After Qin, the Han dynasty brought longevity and light. It opened the Silk Road, connecting China to Rome through merchants, camels, and dreams. Paper was invented, bureaucracy refined, Confucianism enshrined. Empires, East and West, began to echo one another. Both ruled by roads, records, and rituals. Both faced rebellions. Both sought legitimacy not just through might, but through myth. In India, the Maurya Empire rose under Chandragupta and peaked under Ashoka, who turned from war to wisdom. After a brutal campaign in Kalinga, Ashoka embraced Buddhism, inscribing edicts of compassion across his realm in stone. The world was learning. Conquest could be followed by conscience, but not always. As empires expanded, so did slavery, so did taxation, so did the burden of empire itself. Roads brought armies, not just merchants. Language unified, but also erased. Power consolidated, and with it, paranoia. Emperors built monuments to their glory. Yet every empire also dug its own grave, layer by layer. Rome would fall, so would Han, so would the successors of Alexander. But while stones would crumble, the idea of empire, its hunger, its elegance, its promise, would survive. And with it, the tools of domination, the census, the coin, the map. The age of conquest taught humans not just to rule, but to narrate their rule, to rewrite rebellion as treason, to sculpt triumph onto marble friezes, to silence the conquered and call it peace. Still, amid the rubble, something glowed. Trade, ideas, exchange. Even as empires crushed bones, they fertilized futures. A merchant in Rome could wear silk from China. A scholar in Alexandria could read Babylonian star charts. A monk in India could find solace in Greek statuary. Conquest spread suffering, but also synthesis. And so the Age of Empires became not just an era of borders, but of bridges, between East and West, between war and wisdom, between past and possibility. Chapter 5. Prophets, Philosophers, and the Path Within. As empires spread outward, a quieter revolution stirred within. It didn't ride on horseback or sail across seas. It did not conquer cities or carve borders. Instead, it unfolded behind closed eyes, in caves, under banyan trees, across parchment, in silence. Humanity, weary from war and empire, began asking not how to rule the world, but how to rule the self. Let us begin in India. In the 6th century BCE, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama walked away from his palace, his privilege, his future. He sat beneath a fig tree and refused to rise until he understood suffering. What he found was not a god, but a path, the middle way, neither indulgence nor denial, but awareness. This was Buddhism. No temples, no blood sacrifices, just breath. And from that breath, liberation. At the same time, other voices echoed across the subcontinent. The Upanishads probed the nature of reality, karma, dharma, rebirth. Life was not a line, it was a wheel. Liberation wasn't escape from death, but from ignorance. Travel east. In China, a librarian named Laozi grew tired of books. He wrote a short one instead, the Tao Te Ching, and vanished. His message, that the world could not be controlled, only flowed with the Tao was not a doctrine, it was a river. Step too forcefully, and you'd drown. Confucius disagreed. He taught order, not surrender, hierarchy, not drift, but not tyranny. A good ruler led by virtue, not force, ritual, respect, relationship. These were the keys to harmony. His analects, though brief, would shape dynasties. farther west, in Persia. Zoroaster spoke of a cosmic battle between truth and lie, not metaphor but reality. The world was a moral battlefield, and every human choice mattered. Heaven and hell were not just afterlives, but consequences, and in the dry hills of Canaan, prophets thundered, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, voices of the Hebrew tradition, called for justice, not sacrifice. The divine did not dwell in temples alone, but in the treatment of widows, strangers, orphans. Eventually, from this same soil, Jesus of Nazareth would rise, carpenter, teacher, rebel. He preached mercy over law, spirit over letter. His parables turned the world upside down. The meek shall inherit, the poor are blessed, the first will be last. He died as a criminal and became a cornerstone. Centuries later, in the deserts of Arabia, Muhammad would receive a revelation. The Quran, spoken word made eternal. Islam emerged not as a new religion, but as a restoration of Abraham's legacy, submission to one God, justice among humans. These were not isolated eruptions, they were tectonic shifts. Between 800 BCE and 600 CE, the world experienced what historians now call the Axial Age, a moment when civilizations, across continents, began to turn inward, to ask not who rules, but what is right. In Greece, Socrates wandered the streets, annoying citizens with questions. He left no writings, only echoes. His student, Plato, wrote dialogues about justice, soul, and the ideal city. His student, Aristotle, categorized everything from ethics to eels. These thinkers did not always agree, but they shared something sacred, the belief that thought itself could be a path to truth. None of these movements were perfect. Some excluded women, others justified hierarchy. Many were later distorted by institutions, but their seeds remain. They taught us to listen, to doubt, to endure mystery, to ask better questions. In the temples of India, the courtyards of China, the hills of Galilee, and the markets of Athens, humanity glimpsed a strange truth, that salvation, enlightenment, heaven, harmony, whatever name you give it, does not lie in the stars or scrolls, but in the turning of the heart. This chapter of history was not loud. No armies marched for Plato. No temples were built for Confucius during his life. But the aftershocks reshaped the world more deeply than any spear or siege. And so, the age of conquest faded into the age of contemplation. We had learned to rule others. Now, we sought to rule ourselves. Chapter 6. Castles, Crosses, and Crowns. When Rome fell in the west, it didn't crash, it crumbled. In 476 CE, a barbarian king deposed the last Roman emperor, but the empire's shadow lingered, on coins, in cathedrals, and in law codes copied by candlelight. What followed was not darkness, but vast fragmentation. The Middle Ages had begun, not with silence, but with 1,000 clashing voices. In Europe, power broke into pieces. Kings ruled kingdoms, but so did bishops, dukes, and popes. The land was carved into fiefs. Loyalty was sworn not to a nation, but to a lord. This was Gel, feudalism, a pyramid of promises. At the base, peasants bound to the soil. At the peak, a monarch, often more symbolic than sovereign. Castles dotted the landscape, not as palaces but as fortresses. War was constant. Borders shifted like shadows. Yet amid the chaos, communities endured. The church rose as the spine of the continent. Latin prayers crossed mountains. Cathedrals reached heavenward, stained with stories in glass. Monks preserved ancient texts. Priests baptized kings, and popes, from Rome, dared to crown emperors. One such emperor, Charlemagne, united much of Western Europe in the 9th century. Crowned by the Pope as Holy Roman Emperor, he dreamed of a Christian empire reborn. Though his realm fractured after his death, the idea lived on, that Europe was not just a geography, but a Christendom. Meanwhile, in the East, Byzantium thrived. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, blended Greek and Roman legacies with Orthodox Christianity. Its golden domes and silk trade routes stood in contrast to the West's crumbling roads. In the Middle East, Islam flourished. The Umayyads and Abbasids built cities of learning, Baghdad, Damascus, Cordoba. While Europe fought over relics, Islamic scholars preserved and expanded the knowledge of Greeks, Indians, Persians, algebra, astronomy, anatomy. These were studied in Arabic long before they returned to Latin. But contact was coming. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a holy war. Deus vult, they cried. God wills it. Thus began the Crusades, a series of brutal campaigns to retake Jerusalem. Soldiers marched not just for land, but for heaven. They killed, looted, and died in equal measure. The Crusades were not just East versus West. They were Christians against Muslims, Christians against Jews, and sometimes Christians against other Christians. Yet from the carnage came connection, new goods, new words, new wounds. Elsewhere, kingdoms stirred. In England, the Magna Carta was signed in 1215, not for liberty, but for barons' rights. Still, it planted seeds of accountability. In France, kings centralized power. In Spain, Christian and Muslim kingdoms clashed in the long Reconquista. In Russia, Mongol hooves thundered in. The Golden Horde ruled for centuries. But from the ashes rose Moscow, a city that would one day claim to be the Third Rome. Japan, during this era, embraced its own form of feudalism. The emperor reigned, but shoguns ruled. Samurai swore loyalty and lived by the code of Bushido, honor, duty, death before disgrace. In Africa, great kingdoms like Mali rose, with gold-rich cities like Timbuktu becoming centers of learning and trade. Mansa Musa, its emperor, journeyed to Mecca with such wealth that he distorted entire economies, and across the Atlantic, long before European sails appeared, civilizations like the Maya, Aztec, and Inca were building pyramids, calendars, and cities in tune with stars and stone. The world was not still, it pulsed. The Middle Ages were not a single story. They were a tapestry, torn in places, golden in others. They were pilgrimages and plagues, heresies and harvests, swords and sonnets. By the late 1300s, a quiet trembling began, a whisper from Florence, a shimmer in Venice. A resurrection, not of bodies, but of ideas. The Renaissance was on its way. But before we turn the page, let us remember, this age, of castles and crosses, of crowns and crusades, was not backward. It was human, yearning, wrestling with chaos, groping toward light through stained glass and smoke, and in its soil the seeds of modernity waited, ready to bloom. Chapter 7. Sails, Spices, and the Scramble for the World. By the 15th century, maps were no longer sacred. They were invitations. Europe, once boxed in by its own boundaries, began to stretch its limbs, eastward, southward, and most daringly, west. The age of exploration had begun, not with a bang, but with a compass. It started with spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, tiny luxuries from the east that could fetch their weight in gold. The overland Silk Road, long and perilous, had grown treacherous with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, so kingdoms turned to the sea. Portugal led the charge. Prince Henry the Navigator gathered cartographers, astronomers, and sailors. They hugged the African coast, inch by inch. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. He returned with pepper and profits, and a precedent. Spain, jealous and ambitious, looked west. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, armed with flawed maps and iron conviction, stumbled upon the Americas. He thought he had found Asia. He had found something bigger, a new world to conquer. The race was on. Conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro brought gunpowder and smallpox to the Aztecs and Incas. Entire civilizations, rich in culture and astronomy, collapsed under steel and scripture. Gold flowed east. Death followed west. But not all journeys ended in conquest. Some ended in exchange. The Columbian Exchange swapped potatoes for horses, tomatoes for diseases, chocolate for sugarcane plantations. Diets changed. Economies exploded. Populations plummeted and then soared. It was not a meeting, it was a collision. Back in Europe, these discoveries redrew power. Spain and Portugal carved the globe with papal blessing. The Treaty of Tordesillas, England, France, and the Dutch soon joined the fray. Navies grew, colonies sprouted, oceans became highways, and pirates. Well, pirates thrived. In the east, the Mughal Empire blossomed in India, weaving Persian art with Indian tradition. Akbar the Great ruled with tolerance and splendour. In China, the Ming dynasty sent treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean under Admiral Zheng He, massive ships bearing silk and porcelain. But after a few voyages, the sails were furled. The empire turned inward. Japan, too, turned away. After brief contact with Europeans and the spread of Christianity, the Tokugawa shogunate closed its doors, choosing isolation over entanglement. Africa was drawn into a different current. Coastal kingdoms grew rich, trading gold and slaves to European merchants. The Atlantic slave trade would uproot over 12 million souls, human beings reduced to cargo, shipped across oceans, erased from history books, yet never from memory. Meanwhile, in the Americas, colonies multiplied. Sugar in the Caribbean, silver in Potosi, tobacco in Virginia, cotton in the South, the labour, often enslaved, the land, often stolen, the wealth, concentrated in European capitals, draped in velvet and arrogance. But resistance stirred. In the Andes, Incan ghosts whispered. In Haiti, enslaved people would one day revolt. In the forests of Brazil, quilombos, runaway slave communities fought for freedom. Even amid domination, the human spirit rebelled. This was no longer exploration, it was exploitation. But it was also entanglement. Foods, ideas, languages, and gods mingled. From Manila to Mexico City, cultures collided, coexisted, and clashed. A mestizo world was being born, hybrid, haunted, holy. And behind every ship, every trade post, every cross on every hill, loomed a question. Was this destiny, or was it greed dressed as gospel? The world was shrinking, but not evenly. Some became emperors, others indentured. Some sailed, others sank. Still, across oceans and under stars, humanity was reweaving itself, thread by bloodied thread. The globe was no longer a dream. It was a battlefield. It was a market. It was a map waiting to be redrawn. Chapter 8. Ink, Ideas, and the Rebirth of the World. The Renaissance did not explode. It unfolded. It crept out of the shadows of monasteries and flickered to life in Florentine workshops. It sang from cathedral domes and whispered from dusty scrolls. It was not a rejection of the past, but a rediscovery, a rebirth. Renaissance, the French word for rebirth, named a time when Europe remembered it had once been Rome and dared to dream again. At its heart was a revolution of vision. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci dissected corpses and sketched flying machines. He saw the body as a map and the sky as a question. Michelangelo, with hammer and humility, carved David from marble and painted the Sistine ceiling, muscles straining toward divinity. Painters learned to trap light. Writers bent language like steel. Perspective turned flat walls into portals. Human beings, once small before God, were now subjects worthy of study. But it wasn't just beauty, it was inquiry. Petrarch unearthed Cicero. Erasmus mocked priests with wit. Machiavelli asked whether power must be good to be great. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg around 1440, turned ideas into armies. Books multiplied. Literacy spread. The Bible was no longer chained to pulpits. It walked into homes, and there, people read for themselves, which led to tremors. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his grievances to a church door. He challenged indulgences, corruption, and papal power. What followed was not a debate, it was a detonation. The Protestant Reformation fractured Christendom. New sects rose, Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists. The Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation, Jesuits, Baroque art, and the Council of Trent. Europe, once united under Rome, became a mosaic of faiths and fires. Wars of religion raged, but in the ashes, a strange flower bloomed, the notion of wry conscience. Elsewhere, change stirred. In England, Shakespeare staged the human condition, ambition, love, jealousy, beneath candlelit rafters. To be or not to be wasn't just theatre. It was a cry echoing through generations. In France, Montaigne pondered the self. In Spain, Cervantes tilted at windmills. In the Low Countries, painters like Bruegel and Bosch captured peasants, demons, and dreams with equal care. Science, too, dared to look up, and in Copernicus whispered that the Earth was not the centre. Galileo pointed his telescope and saw moons circling Jupiter. Heresy, some said. Truth, others replied. The stars were no longer gods, they were questions. In medicine, Vesalius challenged Galen. In anatomy, Harvey mapped the heartbeat. Nature was not fixed, it was to knowable. But knowledge, like fire, could warm or burn. Witch hunts flared, books were banned, thinkers imprisoned, yet the arc bent onward. The Renaissance taught Europe not just to remember, but to revise. Outside Europe, empires watched and waited. The Ottomans, under Suleiman the Magnificent, built mosques that rivaled cathedrals and legal codes that rivaled Rome. In India, the Mughal emperors blended Persian elegance with Hindu richness. China, under the Ming, turned inward. But its porcelain and poetry still dazzled the world. The Renaissance was not global, but its ripples were. And as ink dried on parchment, ships sailed from ports. The world that had been mapped and conquered was now being imagined. A self-portrait in oil, a poem in iambs, a star chart in ink. Humanity had looked back and seen itself anew, but not all would embrace this gaze. The next chapter would bring revolutions not of canvas or conscience, but of muskets, markets, and manifestos. Chapter 9. Revolutions and the Reckoning of Ideals. The 18th century arrived on horseback. Powdered wigs atop powdered men, with violins playing in gilded salons. But beneath the minuets and manners, something trembled. The world had been ruled by kings, priests, and empires for millennia, but whispers of equality, liberty, and reason began to flicker like candles in stormy halls, and soon they would set whole continents ablaze. It began in thought. Voltaire mocked monarchs with his pen. Rousseau declared that man was born free, yet everywhere in chains. Locke wrote of a life, liberty, and property. The Enlightenment had begun, an age where reason was throne, and the individual its sovereign. Then thought became thunder. In 1776, 13 colonies on the edge of an empire declared independence. The American Revolution was not just a rebellion against taxes, it was a manifesto. We hold these truths to be self-evident, words that echoed beyond muskets. Across the Atlantic, France listened. In 1789, the Bastille fell. The monarchy crumbled. Heads rolled. The Declaration of the Rights of Man rang through the streets. But revolution, once uncaged, does not walk, it runs. The Reign of Terror, the rise of Napoleon. From liberty to empire in a heartbeat, still the idea could not be silenced. In Haiti, enslaved people rose. Led by Toussaint Louverture, they fought the French and founded the first free black republic in the New World. In Latin America, Bolívar dreamed of liberation. In Europe, revolutions spread like wildfire. Some crushed, some crowned. Even industry rebelled. The Industrial Revolution began in British mills, where machines devoured cotton and spat out cloth. Steam-powered engines, locomotives, empires, cities swelled, chimneys rose, and time itself changed, measured not by sun or seasons, but by factory bells. Progress brought peril, children worked, rivers blackened, wealth piled in palaces, while workers toiled in soot, but unions, writers, and reformers pushed back. Dickens exposed, Marx theorized. He saw history not as glory, but struggle, class against class, capital against labour. The workers have nothing to lose but their chains, he wrote, and chains, once visible, became systemic. Meanwhile, empires reached their zenith. Britain ruled a quarter of the globe, France, Belgium, and others carved Africa with rulers and rifles. This scramble for Africa ignored borders, peoples and histories. Colonies were not gifts, they were wounds. But resistance stirred again. In India, sepoys mutinied. In China, the Opium Wars opened ports with gunboats. In the Congo, horror reigned under Leopold's ghostly hand. And yet, in whispers and songs, revolutions prepared their return. The 19th century ended breathless. Railroads snaking continents, telegraphs skipping oceans, ideas bursting through borders. It was a century of invention, emancipation, exploitation, and contradiction. It birthed socialism and nationalism, Darwin and Dostoevsky, steamships and suffragettes, a century where utopias were imagined and nightmares industrialized. Humanity had learned to think, to question, to revolt, but it had not yet learned to restrain its ambition. And in the distance, shadows gathered, alliances hardened, factories shifted from cloth to cannon. The age of ideals had not ended, but it was about to be tested in trenches and treaties, in blood and betrayal. The 20th century waited, and it would not wait gently. Chapter 10. World on Fire, World in Code. The 20th century did not tiptoe in, it stormed. It opened with kings on horseback and closed with astronauts on the moon. Between those bookends lay a century of brilliance and brutality, of dreams digitized and nightmares industrialized. In 1914, the old world order shattered. Empires, linked by treaties and rivalries, stumbled into war. The assassination of an archduke lit the fuse, but the dynamite had long been laid. World War I dragged trenches across Europe and turned fields into graveyards. Gas, machine guns, and sorrow. Progress retooled for death. The war ended in 1918 with treaties that punished more than they healed. Germany simmered. Russia had already boiled over. In 1917, Lenin led the Bolsheviks into power, birthing the Soviet Union, an empire of ideology, not royalty. Red flags rose. So did fear. The 1920s roared with jazz and factory whistle, but the crash came in 1929. The Great Depression swept across oceans, banks fell, bread lines grew. The world asked, could capitalism survive itself? Into the chaos marched new answers, and new tyrants. In Italy, Mussolini. In Germany, Hitler. In Spain, Franco. Fascism wrapped itself in flags and promises. It blamed the outsider, it punished the weak, and it prepared for war. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. World War II began. It was not just a war of armies, it was a war of annihilation. The Holocaust, Hiroshima, total war, civilians became targets, science became weapon. 6 years, 60 million dead. The world watched itself burn and promised never again. But peace was fractured. The Cold War split the globe into two ideologies, capitalism and communism. The URSS and USSR raced to build bombs, launch satellites, influence every inch of Earth. Proxy wars raged in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. Walls were built, and then, miraculously, torn down. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The USSR collapsed in 1991. One superpower remained. But the world was not simpler, just more connected. Meanwhile, revolutions returned, quietly. Civil rights, feminism, LGBTQ+ liberation. Anti-colonial movements swept Africa, Asia, the Caribbean. Ghana, Algeria, India, Indonesia, nations reclaimed their names, flags changed, but the wounds of empire, racism, and inequality lingered. Technology raced ahead. Televisions became teachers. Computers became companions. The internet, born from Cold War wires, became a new frontier, one where borders blurred and voices multiplied, knowledge democratized. But so did misinformation. 9/11 changed the world again. Fear surged. Surveillance grew. Wars returned, vague, asymmetrical, endless, and still. The world spun faster. Smartphones made the globe pocket-sized. Social media turned everyone into a broadcaster. Revolutions could be tweeted. lies could go viral. Truth became slippery. Climate changed, not in metaphor but in temperature and tide. Fires raged, ice melted, oceans rose, scientists warned, corporations stalled, and youth marched in the streets. And then came a virus. In 2020, COVID-19 silenced cities. It humbled nations. It revealed fault lines, economic, racial, political. But it also revealed resilience. Healthcare workers, teachers, neighbours, the quiet backbone of humanity, rose to meet the moment. As the century approached its quarter mark, new challenges loomed. Artificial intelligence, genetic editing, surveillance capitalism, loneliness in a connected world, democracy under strain, authoritarianism with a digital face. Yet, amid the uncertainty, echoes from the past remain. The curiosity of Galileo, the defiance of Harriet Tubman, the dreams of Mandela, the equations of Ada Lovelace, the songs of protest, and the whispers of peace. We are not the first to face collapse, nor the last to imagine renewal. The story of human civilization is not linear, it spirals, forward, backward, upward, and in, and now, the quill is passed to us, not to end the story, but to continue it, with grace, with courage, and with eyes wide open. Wind down, a whisper at the end of time. Let us take one final breath together, and let it go. Across 10,000 years, we have wandered, through dust and fire, ink and empire. We've built towers of stone and code, prayed to gods with 1,000 names, and traced constellations in the quiet of night. We've crowned kings and toppled them. We've spilled ink and blood and song. We've looked into the void, and still we painted. We are the children of stars and stories, of questions we never stopped asking. What is power? What is time? What is the self? And now, here, in this strange, trembling present, we hold the weight of it all. The hopes of pharaohs, the fears of crusaders, the dreams of rebels and engineers, not as a burden, but as a beacon. The fire still burns, the page is still blank, and though the future is unwritten, it is not unfelt. So close your eyes, not in sleep, but in reverence, for all that has been, and all that might still become, because history is not behind us, it is within us, still whispering, still waiting, still becoming. Good night, traveller.